G'day YouTube, Warbles on a lot here, with part 15 of Australia's Day of National Shame, book reading of Darwin 1942, Australia's Darkest Hour by Timothy Hall. And as I've said on previous episodes, that line, Australia's Day of National Shame, is a direct quote from Governor-General Paul Hasluck, who was in Darwin on the day when he was later unveiling a memorial plaque to honour those who died during the bombing. This chapter is called The Exodus. It's 13 pages long and I'm going to try and get through it in a single reading. When the convoy had slipped back into the harbour on the evening of February 18, those living in the town had known just as well as the servicemen what it meant. The fear of a raid, which had haunted most people constantly since Pearl Harbor, was increased by their concern for what might happen afterwards. The Allied propaganda, which had been pumped out to show the Japanese as brutal subhumans, was now working in reverse, and when the raids finally eventuated, people could almost hear the sound of the Japanese running up the beaches with fixed steel. It needed only a signal to start a stampede, and it came soon enough, but just as at the RAAF station, a firm hand would have had precisely the reverse effect. Quote, "If there had been any effective leadership from anybody," Mr. Justice Lowe, the Royal Commissioner, said a month later, "whether civilian or military, normal conditions might have returned very quickly. But leadership was one thing that was conspicuously lacking." Unquote. There were people running everywhere, calling out to the next person, asking what they should do, and all getting a different answer. Policemen were telling civilians that Darwin was being evacuated ahead of the Japanese, and that the best thing they could do was get out of town. Army Provost Corps NCOs, non-commissioned officers, were shouting at civilians to get the hell out of Darwin because civvies weren't wanted there. Nobody knew what to do, and there was bitter anger that they were still in Darwin at all, and not in some safe corner of Australia far away from this battle zone. By far the most commonly heard sentiment was, quote, "Well, I'm getting out. There's nothing to stay here for," unquote. At the US headquarters, people were pouring out of the building and racing out of town. ARP wardens had joined forces with the police and were going round telling anyone they met that they must get out of town fast, and all around them people saw friends, colleagues, bosses and servicemen on the run. The administration offices had been cleared of books and papers even before the second alarm began to wail over the town. Public servants appeared with piles of official-looking files, none of them of the slightest importance, but all giving their bearer the excuse to say that he had an essential reason for leaving town. As at the RAAF, with no direction or leadership and with conflicting orders and suggestions coming at them from all sides, people ran everywhere like a flock of sheep and panicked. By the time the second alarm sounded, the general stampede was on. Some gathered as many possessions as they could carry and, weighed down by the size of them, staggered off to join the procession heading south along the only road out of Darwin, the Stuart Highway. All that afternoon and through the next day, a steady stream of civilians poured down the highway. One man went in his bedroom slippers, carrying his swag and leaving behind all his other worldly possessions. By the middle of the afternoon, people were trying to get away in anything they could find. Trucks, cars, motorbikes, push bikes and even on foot. Although the first stop, Adelaide River, was 100 kilometres or 60 miles down the track. Someone stole the council road grader and 9 people clung to its side for the 22-hour journey to Adelaide River. Even the sanitary carts went, leaving Darwin with no way of disposing of its domestic sewage and seriously increasing the risk of disease. Houses went for 10 days in the tropical heat without their usual twice-weekly clearance, and the smell was overpowering. Pan toilets, right? Shit in a bucket, put the lid on, drip some Dettol or phenol into there to try and keep the maggots down. They stink pretty bad even when they're getting emptied regular. It was 5 days before anyone even bothered to go down to Adelaide River to bring them back. The crew of many of the ships that had sunk or been damaged were quick to leave, and the chief mate of the USS Meigs, the big transport that had been part of the Timor convoy, was seen striding southwards near the head of the procession, followed closely by most of his Javanese crew. A few stores stayed open, hoping for business from those leaving the town. One shopkeeper handed over without charge his entire stock to ease the journey of those travelling to safety in the cattle trucks. But for the most part, businesses closed with the raid, and civil life to all intents and purposes came to a standstill. Some people were told to leave, like a group of 80 Sydney waterboard workers who had been flown to Darwin to camouflage the airfield. Others were specifically told not to leave but disobeyed the order, among them a key group of telegraph and telephone technicians. By dusk, there was probably not a wharfie left in town, most of them echoing the RAAF men who had told Group Captain Sherger that they were not going to stay and face the Japanese when they were not even armed. A representative of the Chinese community, Ming Ket, went to the ARP office and asked whether the Chinese should stay and help. Nobody would give them an answer, so he returned to the Chinese quarter and led most of his people out of town. Nothing was worse for the morale of the citizens than the sight of all those people to whom they looked for leadership rushing to leave without a care for their employees or staff. Many of them insisted that Abbott, A-B-B-O-T-T, had told them to go, but that did not prevent him writing a confidential memorandum to his minister in which he complained that on the evening of the raid there was not a single officer in the administration left to help him. Quote, "They had all gone," he wrote, "apparently without orders but obeying the general rumour, which was so prevalent that civilians must leave the town at once." Few of the professional men in Darwin left with such single-mindedness as the bank managers, who in most cases left without giving any instructions to the staff who remained behind. One man went without even telling his staff that he was going. The managers gathered up their cash and securities, about £300,000 worth in all, half of which belonged to the Commonwealth Bank, which payrolled the Americans and Australian armies, and hurriedly left Darwin to travel much of the way to Alice Springs in extreme discomfort on a flat-top truck. Again, they said in their defence that Abbott, A-B-B-O-T-T, had told them all to go, but none were heard to complain, and nobody apparently suggested the obvious solution of sending only one of them to Alice Springs with a more junior employee to ride shotgun if necessary. A week after the managers had gone, their staff had not heard a word from them, and 3 weeks later they were working in labour gangs to clear the streets. They would probably have been there 3 months later if one of the clerks in frustration had not hitchhiked to Alice Springs and demanded some attention. Only then were they given their movement orders. The contribution of the army was deplorable. The official war history records that soldiers as well as airmen ran away after the raid, but the effect of this on morale would have been insignificant compared with the ill-timed and secretive departure at 3 o'clock on the morning of the raid of almost all the soldiers from Larrakia Barracks. It galvanised the civilians who had not already gone into assuming that the Japanese really must be on the way, and it reinforced the widespread belief that the army, instead of trying to help the people, was concerned only with saving its own skin. As the 2,000 soldiers made their moonlight departure, they called out from their trucks, quote, "Get out as fast as you can," unquote. Their commander, Major General David Blake, later objected to the use of the word, quote, "dispersal," unquote, to describe the military's clandestine departure. Quote, "It sounds," he complained, "as if we ran away," unquote, which was no doubt why the word was used in the first place. It would have been difficult for most people to see it in any other way when Blake set up his advance position 35 kilometres behind a buffer of 1,000 unarmed civilians. And the Army's other contribution to Darwin's welfare, the Provost Corps, was nothing more than an unruly, undisciplined, drunken mob. The Naval Intelligence Chief in Darwin, Lieutenant Commander James McManus, did not attempt to hide his contempt for those civilians who fled southwards at top speed, any more than Major Blake did. Quote, "It takes a few bombs to show what people are made of," he said bitterly, "and the civilian population was made of very poor material indeed. They just dropped their bundles and ran." Unquote. But there was no reason why they shouldn't have run. They were only there in the first place because the administration had been slow in evacuating them, and they were certainly not subject to any military discipline. They were unarmed civilians, far ahead of the army's advanced position, expecting at any moment to see a horde of murderous Japanese soldiers storming up the beach or landing by parachute. And they saw all those people to whom they looked for an example and from whom they would have taken direction, abandoning them to their own fate. Anyone who stayed in that situation would have been out of their minds. But it was the way that they went that gave them the appearance, as Union leader Joe Walker put it, of, quote, a rabble, unquote. Homes were abandoned and a lifetime's possessions thrown away. There was no planning, no thought for what might be needed a week or a month later. Worst of all, there was a complete lack of care for friends, neighbours, and in some cases, even for elderly relatives living in other parts of Darwin. Shit, sounds just like the Liberal and National Party. Mothers and fathers waited for their children to come and take them to safety, but the children were already well down the Stuart Highway, indifferent to anything but their own safety. In hotels, half-finished drinks stood on tables, beds remained unmade, food burned in ovens, letters were started and left, sometimes midway through a word. Even at Government House, the mail that Abbott, A-B-B-O-T-T, had been reading when the bombs fell was still lying where he had dropped it 3 weeks later. Most of those leaving had no idea where they were going. Their only concern was to put as much distance as possible between themselves and Darwin and the Japanese. There was only one road out, so there was no chance of taking the wrong turn. Many drove their cars until they ran out of petrol and then abandoned them by the side of the road. Others got bogged, and when nobody would help them push their cars clear, they got out and left them. Most people who were asked said they were heading for Adelaide River without knowing what they would find there or what lay beyond it. It was simply the next place south of Darwin. In fact, Adelaide River was then nothing more than a military camp, and beyond the river the road petered out into a rough track that was almost impassable in the wet. Not until later in the war did Army engineers extend the road to Birdham, 320 kilometres further south. The mass flight became known as the Adelaide River Stakes, a phrase that would be coined again more than 30 years later when Darwin was flattened once more by Cyclone Tracy and a near stampede ensued. The administration's main concern was that the township should not be swamped by far more people than it could cope with, and that the road was kept open for urgent military traffic. By next morning, there were more than 1,200 refugees at Adelaide River, and they had to be urgently separated into the old, the infirm, and the sick, as well as those who could not be allowed to take up valuable space on the trains or the planes that were flying them out. It was an important job, but not one that warranted the presence of the administrator, the Supreme Court judge, and a Major General, all of whom arrived in the next few days. The administrator, Abbott, A-B-B-O-T-T, arrived before the others, having left Darwin on the very next morning after the raid, a time when most of his subordinates thought he should have been in Darwin. Right? Abbott was one of the first cowards to run away from Darwin. There was still no military authority when Blake acted. It was more because the situation warranted it than anything else. At Adelaide River, for example, he quickly solved the problem of what to do with 300 able-bodied men who were trying to get to Adelaide by compulsorily enlisting them in the army and forming them into labour gangs. Asked if they had raised any objection at this gross violation of their rights, Blake replied bluntly, quote, "They couldn't," unquote. But that wasn't true, as a confidential memorandum to Lieutenant General V.A.H. Sturdy, the Chief of the General Staff, reveals, quote, "I have seen reports in the press," Blake wrote, "that some measures of military control has been established here, but I have no instructions and little warrant or authority for many of my decisions, other than that of necessity." Unquote. When the people of Darwin looked around for those whom they expected to be setting the example after the second raid, they couldn't even find the administrator's wife. For within half an hour of the end of the first raid, Hilda Abbott, Abbott, was being driven out of Darwin by one of the town's dwindling number of policemen who were left to care for the citizens. As well as the constable, she took her cook, chauffeur and 2 Aboriginal or half-caste maids. Judge Wells described her departure as having caused a great deal of resentment and something, quote, "that did much to increase the panic that followed," unquote. Hilda Abbott, Abbott, had been only shaken in the raid. Quote, "Her husband had an injured eardrum." Sorry, that was bracket. Husband had an injured eardrum. And she could have done more than most in Darwin to calm and help the women, most of whom were confused and frightened. Instead, she chose to leave. Abbott's understandable concern that she should go to safety lost a little of its glitter when it was found out how he intended to send her. Not for the administrator's wife a cattle truck, or even the police limousine that she was already in, but something far grander. At the most demanding time that most railway men had ever known, Abbott, Abbott, told the Commissioner to roll out of its special shed the huge, ornate, 36-ton state railway coach that was hooked onto the back of a train when he was on tour around the state. The message went to Railway Commissioner George Garn, who did not even bother to seek the approval from the Home Affairs Minister in Melbourne before rattling off a telegram to Abbott, regretting that he could not have the carriage. He then told the Minister what he was doing and secured his approval. In the course of the conversation, another incident involving Abbott, Abbott, and his curious ideas about his rights came to light. The Minister told Garn that the administrator had sent him a telegram asking for petrol for his car for the whole journey from Darwin to Adelaide. That was also refused. It was probably Darwin's misfortune that it had as its administrator, Abbott, Abbott, quote, "a man who had completely lost the confidence of the public and of everyone," unquote, as Mr Justice Wells, the Territory's sole Supreme Court judge, put it shortly afterwards. Wharfie Joe Walker put the view of virtually all Darwin's workforce when he said, quote, "he was a constant drag on the place. I can't think of anything beneficial to anyone that Mr Abbott, Abbott, ever did," unquote. Charles Lydiard Aubrey Abbott, a former politician who had held the portfolio of Minister for Home Affairs in 1928, had been the administrator of the Territory since 1937. He was straight-laced, snobbish and unable to communicate with the Unionists. Shitty sounds like the budgie smuggling wingnut, who were a very strong force in Darwin and made no secret of his dislike for them. He was a man, as Judge Wells put it, in whom public confidence had sunk to, quote, "below zero," unquote, by the time of the raid. Just wait till the Indonesians start sinking Australian patrol boats and see how much the Australian public has confidence in Tony Abbott, Abbott. Very soon after arriving in Darwin, he had organised a gang of civil servants to break a strike of wharf labourers who were refusing to unload a ship. Yeah? After 3 days, the ship sailed without being unloaded. Abbott, Abbott, always defended his unpopularity on the grounds that most small towns like Darwin divide themselves into factions and that there was a long background of political turmoil. But when asked if any of the factions were sympathetic towards him, he said, quote, "No, they're all generally ready to oppose me," unquote. Abbott, Abbott, would not accept that most people in the town were, to put it no higher, not his friends. Quote, "I wouldn't say they are not my friends or my enemies. I don't know them," unquote, he said. At one time or another, no less than 6 public servants had gone to Judge Wells and asked his advice because they felt they could not go on working under Abbott, A-B-B-O-T-T. 2 told him that they had decided to resign. Wells told them that Abbott, A-B-B-O-T-T, was not worth giving up their careers for, and they reluctantly stayed on in their jobs. Wells's disapproval of the administrator was certainly not because of any liberal tendencies, that means left-wing in this case. He himself was notorious in some circles for repeatedly bemoaning the fact that he could not flog Aborigines, and in court spoke of them, quote, getting out of hand, unquote, and becoming too cheeky, unquote, because they were being given rights by the government. But he was never afraid to come to the support of the people of Darwin if he believed that they were being badly served by the public service or the government. And in Abbott, A-B-B-O-T-T, he saw a perpetual stumbling block. People find it very difficult to deal with Abbott, A-B-B-O-T-T, because he is a man whose word you cannot depend upon, he explained, and they are right, unquote. These are quotes from the Royal Commission hearings. This is the evidence. This is the findings. Abbott was a man whose word you cannot depend upon. At the height of the clearing up program, when every available man was needed to take the injured to hospital, to collect the dead, to supervise the evacuation of the women, children and sick, Abbott, A-B-B-O-T-T, instructed Superintendent Stretton to send a sergeant and 2 constables to Government House to help remove and pack his property. Stretton agreed to this extraordinary request without even questioning it, claiming that Abbott, A-B-B-O-T-T, was the Commissioner of Police and it was therefore not for him to question his orders. He sent across Sergeant William Littlejohn and Constables Leo Law and Bob Darkin. Even before they were removed from their urgent duties, the total strength of the police force was only 15, which includes the prosecutor, a clerk and an elderly officer who dealt with motor registrations. When they got to the house, Abbott, A-B-B-O-T-T, told Law to go down into the cellar, quote, and tell me what you see there, unquote. Puzzled, Law came up and told him he could see a large amount of liquor. This seemed to please Abbott, who told the constable to, quote, go and get a police car and we'll take it to the commandant, unquote, who was Major General Blake. Law did as he was told, and at the police station told Stretton what he thought of being made to act as a servant to Abbott, A-B-B-O-T-T, at such a time. Stretton shrugged but told him that there was no car available. Shortly afterwards, however, a police truck was taken out of emergency service and sent to Government House. The police were in the middle of taking the drink to the truck when Judge Wells arrived. He was still there when Abbott, A-B-B-O-T-T, told Littlejohn that he could now start bringing out the crockery and glass, but it must first be carefully packed. And when they had done that, they could fetch his wife's clothes and pack them. Wells later said that he couldn't believe his eyes, but that he said nothing in front of the officers because Abbott, A-B-B-O-T-T, was still their commissioner. What he did point out loudly was that any liquor in Government House was the government's property. It was later claimed that it was sent to Blake's residence and from there distributed around the various messes in Darwin. At one stage there were actually 4 policemen busily packing and carrying out the administrator and Mrs. Abbott's belongings, A-B-B-O-T-T. Meanwhile, the civil defence were frantic because they could find no one to take all the injured to the hospital or to search for more injured people in the bombed ruins. Abbott, A-B-B-O-T-T, later said that he did not know that the liquor was being taken out and that it had been arranged by Stretton, a statement that was angrily dismissed as a lie by Law in particular, who said that Abbott, A-B-B-O-T-T, had helped them carry everything out. Wells supported him. At that time, one of the constables had to take an urgent message to Major General Blake and he had to wait until he could stop a passing car because the only police vehicle available was being loaded with the crockery. The job took more than 3 hours. But as though that wasn't enough, Sergeant Littlejohn and Superintendent Stretton accompanied the truck all the way to Alice Springs, nearly 800 kilometres, 500 miles, south. When he was asked if he did not think there were more worthwhile tasks for the senior police officer in Darwin than escorting the administrator's cups and saucers to Alice, Stretton said that he was just obeying orders, the Nuremberg defence. Inevitably, the story quickly spread around the town and caused great resentment. Victor Carrington, an unpopular district officer at Alice Springs, who was sent by Abbott, ABBOTT, soon afterwards to take over from White as acting government secretary in Darwin, defended the taking of the Crockery from Government House and the use of 4 policemen and a police truck on the grounds that, quote, "It is, after all, government stuff, monogrammed and good class," unquote. To which the Royal Commissioner, Mr Justice Lowe, remarked coldly, quote, "There does seem to be a certain incongruity in moving government crockery, even if it does have a monogram on it, on the day that the town has been blasted by an air raid," unquote. But if this incident caused much anger in the town, and particularly among the police, it was nothing to the reaction when it was learnt that all the time the china, glassware and Mrs Abbott's clothing, ABBOTT, was being removed from the house, a dead half-caste maid was lying buried almost within reach of them, and that Abbott, ABBOTT, knew about this, but insisted that the crockery was taken out before she was removed. When the raid started, Abbott, ABBOTT, and his wife and 8 servants took cover under the office. He had not bothered to have slip trenches dug. No sooner were they there than a bomb exploded only 15 metres from the office, the whole concrete floor lifted bodily above them, and the reinforced concrete pillars snapped like twigs. A half-caste maid was struck by a concrete block, and a young Aboriginal odd job man was trapped by a leg. The man was freed and the others fled to the cliff face and took cover there until the end of the raid. All that is except Daisy Martin, the half-caste maid. Her fate became the subject of an extraordinary controversy that was never properly resolved, for it was suggested, on oath before the Royal Commission, that she might not even have been dead. Constable Bob Darkin was a policeman whom Abbott agreed was, quote, ABBOTT, Abbott agreed was a sensible person and not a type likely to make a grave allegation without believing it was true, unquote. Darkin told the Royal Commission that when he arrived at Government House he knew that the girl's body was under the building, bracket, the office and the house were immediately next to each other, close bracket, and that he was quite prepared to remove the body. Indeed, when he finally did take the body away, it was a simple job that took only half an hour. He was cross-examined by John Barry, King's Counsel, assisting the Commissioner and who later became a judge. Quote, "Was it equally obvious the previous day, bracket, i.e. the day of the raid, close bracket, as it was the next day that it would take half an hour?" Unquote, Barry demanded. Quote, "Yes," replied Darkin. "People in the residence at the time knew that the half-caste was still crying out for somebody to take her out of the wreckage, and that carried on for half an hour or 20 minutes. Unquote. "Was that before the order was given to remove the liquor?" Unquote. "Yes," Darkin told him, "during the air raid, after the bombing." Unquote. Quote, "How do you know the girl was dead?" Quote, I did not know." Unquote. Quote, "Do you mean to tell me that the bystanders saw you leaving that woman there?" Unquote, Barry asked incredulously. Quote, "Yes, that is the position." Barry then asked Darkin if he understood the seriousness of what he was saying, that he might have been able to give help to the woman and save her life, but was prevented from doing so because he was ordered to remove the china and crockery. Darkin was unswerving that that was what had happened. Quote, "You have no doubt that it was true." Unquote. Quote, "It was true." Unquote. Quote, "You were merely carrying out orders?" Quote, "Yes," Darkin told him. Everyone who was under the house was aware of what had happened, and Barry asked Darkin to describe the girl's injuries that he saw when he eventually removed the body the next day. Darkin said that the only injury visible was, quote, "a little scratch on the lip." Unquote. The body appeared uninjured except for a scratch, quote, Barry repeated. And Darkin said, quote, "Yes, to all appearances, she died from strangulations and suffocation." Unquote. The body was taken to the morgue, but nobody saw it there, and she was buried before a post-mortem could be conducted. Darkin protested to Sergeant Littlejohn about the work that they were doing, and Littlejohn, echoing Stretton, replied that they had their orders from the administrator. Quote, "It was loathsome," Darkin said angrily later, "but I had no choice, and as a matter of police discipline, we did just have to carry out orders." Unquote. He did suggest sarcastically to Little John, as they carried out a pile of Mrs. Abbott's clothes, that they could have been salvaging their own possessions. Darkin lost everything in the raid. Sergeant William McKinnon also gave evidence that they had known of a woman under the floor while they took the drink and crockery out, and Abbott again agreed that he was, quote, a satisfactory observer, unquote. Abbott, A-B-B-O-T-T, was questioned very closely and at length about how he could possibly leave a dead girl lying in the rubble, while a few metres away he calmly supervised the removal of his silver and crockery, even if she was dead. He agreed that this was indeed what happened, and said only that, quote, there was a good deal of confusion at the time, unquote. Quote, why was there no endeavour made to extricate her? Quote, the Commissioner asked. Quote, because I assumed without doubt that she was dead, he said. That he assumed from the pallor of the girl's legs that she was dead, unquote, and that he regarded this as sufficient justification not to make any effort to extricate her. Superintendent Stretton did not emerge much more creditably. The Commissioner asked him if he had taken any steps to find out if the girl was dead or alive. When he heard that she might still be alive, he said that he had not. Quote, did you discuss with the Administrator whether anything could be done to get her body out? Quote. Answer, quote, no, said Stretton. This much then is certain, said John Barry. Although 3 police officers went over there, no endeavour was made on the 19th to retrieve the body, unquote. Stretton agreed that he had had no discussion at all with Abbott that day about getting the body out, and that the conversation had only arisen the next day when the Administrator was leaving the house to go and stay with Major General Blake. Abbott, A-B-B-O-T-T, then remarked, quote, you had better arrange to get the body of Mary Martin out, unquote. Mary Martin was 18, and hers was the last body to be removed from the town. The others had all been taken away the previous day. Here endeth part 15 of Australia's Day of National Shame, with the shameful part of Administrator Abbott rescuing his wife's underpants and the crockery and leaving people to die under the rubble while he commandeered a police truck and 3 police officers, as well as Superintendent Stretton. Warbles on a lot to YouTube. More will follow. Ciao.